When Roman authority entered Alexandria in the final days of Cleopatra's rule, it did not behave like an invading army. It behaved like an institution assuming custody. The banners were lowered, the gates were counted, and the city, long accustomed to spectacle, was quietly measured. Cleopatra was no longer a sovereign adversary. She was a variable to be managed. Rome did not fear her armies. They were gone. Rome did not fear her alliances. They had dissolved. Rome feared her symbolism. For 3 centuries, Egypt had represented something Rome could not fully domesticate: ancient continuity, ritual legitimacy, and a ruler who did not require Roman permission to command reverence. Cleopatra embodied all three. Her power was no longer military, but it was still operational. That made her dangerous in a different way. Roman doctrine did not destroy such figures immediately. It neutralized them. The first Roman units entering the palace complex were not executioners. They were record keepers, guards, and legal observers. Their role was not punishment. Their role was preservation of evidence, of order, of narrative. Cleopatra was placed under observation. Not imprisonment in the modern sense, but something colder, controlled presence. Her movements were noted. Her communications were restricted. Her attendants were reduced. Rooms once used for ceremony were reassigned for surveillance. Doors remained open where privacy had once been assumed. This was not humiliation. It was administrative reduction. Rome understood that the end of a queen did not require blood. It required erasure through procedure. The Roman command structure treated Cleopatra not as an enemy leader, but as a political asset awaiting disposition. Her body was intact. Her title was functionally suspended. Her future was undecided, but already narrowed. There were precedents. Rome had absorbed kings before. Some were paraded, some were exiled, some were quietly removed from the record. The method depended on what story Rome needed to tell next. And the story Rome needed in Egypt was stability. Cleopatra, alive and visible, complicated that story. Within days, Roman administrators began compiling inventories: treasuries, religious artifacts, diplomatic correspondence, scrolls bearing royal seals. Nothing was seized publicly. Everything was catalogued. Power was being translated from ritual into record. Cleopatra was permitted appearances, but not authority. She was allowed to speak, but not command. Audiences were supervised. Messages were filtered. The queen remained present, yet increasingly irrelevant. This was intentional. Rome believed power faded fastest when allowed to exist without effect. The Roman soldiers assigned to her presence were not brutes. They were disciplined, silent, trained to stand without reaction. Their purpose was not to intimidate her physically, but to signal that her world now operated on Roman terms. She noticed the changes. The palace no longer smelled of incense during meetings. The guards no longer responded to her name. The protocols shifted subtly but decisively. Rome did not insult her lineage. Rome ignored it. That was the punishment. Cleopatra's court, once a living organism of advisors, priests, and foreign envoys, began to hollow out. Some were dismissed. Some defected. Some were reassigned under Roman supervision. Loyalty, once a currency, became a liability. Every institution around her was being repurposed. Temples were left standing, but their funding was redirected. Officials kept their titles but reported elsewhere. Symbols remained visible but disconnected from authority. This was how Rome conquered without spectacle. Cleopatra's personal safety was never overtly threatened. That, too, was deliberate. Rome needed her calm. Panic would create unpredictability. Desperation could produce myth, so Rome applied pressure slowly. Requests were denied without explanation. Meetings were postponed indefinitely. Letters went unanswered. She was not told her fate. She was allowed to imagine it. Roman control did not operate through cruelty. It operated through waiting. Every day that passed without resolution diminished her relevance. The city adjusted. Markets reopened. Officials recalibrated. Egypt learned to function without her voice. This was the real mechanism of Roman power, normalization. Cleopatra was still alive, but the state was already moving on. Roman historians would later describe this period briefly, almost dismissively. They preferred endings with drama, but the truth is quieter and far more instructive. The most damaging act Rome committed against Cleopatra was not confinement. It was transition. It became a figure from the previous administrative cycle. Even her image began to change. Portraits ceased being commissioned. Coinage stopped circulating. Public references to her name were reduced, not banned, just allowed to fade. Rome understood memory economics. What is not reinforced disappears. The soldiers around her did not taunt or provoke. They followed orders precisely. Their discipline was a message. Nothing she did now existed outside Roman jurisdiction. She could not appeal to the people. She could not appeal to the gods without Roman awareness. She could not appeal to history without Roman authorship. This was containment at the level of meaning. And beneath it all, a decision was forming, one that required her to remain intact, compliant, and present until Rome decided what story her end would serve. Because Rome did not yet know how it wanted Cleopatra to conclude. A public display risked sympathy, a quiet removal risked legend. A delay risked irrelevance but also control. So Rome waited, and in that waiting, something more unsettling emerged. Cleopatra was not being prepared for death, she was being prepared for use. As a symbol, as a warning, as a footnote engineered by the victor, her final days were not filled with violence or chaos. They were filled with silence, supervision, and the slow recognition that her life now existed inside a Roman administrative process she could not interrupt. This was not an execution phase. It was a holding phase, and Rome was very patient. Once Cleopatra's presence had been stabilized, observed, reduced, and rendered administratively inert, the second phase began. This phase did not concern her body. It concerned the systems around her. Rome no longer needed to watch Cleopatra closely. It needed to watch everything else. The palace became a node in a wider Roman network. Reports flowed outward. Decisions flowed inward. Egyptian officials were asked to confirm procedures they no longer controlled. Religious authorities were consulted, not commanded. The language of governance shifted from decree to documentation. Cleopatra remained central in name only. Roman officers began occupying adjacent administrative spaces. Not her chambers, but the corridors that led to influence, archives, treasury rooms, diplomatic halls. Control was exerted indirectly. Cleopatra could still request, but she could not execute. This was the Roman method: isolate authority from action. Her household was restructured. Trusted attendants were replaced with neutral intermediaries. Scribes were reassigned. Messages were transcribed before delivery. Every word passed through Roman interpretation, not censorship. Context management. Rome understood that speech becomes powerless when its consequences are predetermined. Cleopatra was still allowed ritual observances, but Roman observers were present, not to interfere but to note. Religion was being studied, not suppressed. Rome had no interest in offending Egyptian belief. It had interest in absorbing it. Power that can be cataloged can be controlled. Outside the palace, Alexandria adjusted quickly. Markets aligned with Roman standards. Coin circulation shifted. Public announcements referenced Roman authority first, Egyptian tradition second. The city was learning a new hierarchy. Quietly. Cleopatra's name still appeared in ceremonial language, but not in policy. She was present in form, absent in function. This distinction mattered. Rome's greatest concern was not Cleopatra's survival. It was narrative containment. The final days of a ruler often become the most dangerous because they invite interpretation. So Rome tightened informational control. Foreign envoys were restricted, messengers delayed, external correspondence was minimized. Cleopatra's ability to influence perception beyond Alexandria was reduced to near zero. She was being localized. Within Roman documentation, she was no longer referred to as queen. She was referred to as the Egyptian ruler formerly in command. Language stripped authority without confrontation. Titles were not revoked, they were archived. Cleopatra understood the implication. Her options narrowed not through threats but through absence of response. Every inquiry met silence. Every proposal stalled. Time itself became an instrument. Roman governance favored delay over denial. Delay created resignation. The soldiers assigned to her presence changed as well. Early observers were replaced with higher-ranking personnel, not more aggressive but more permanent. Their posture was not watchful. It was settled. Rome was no longer guarding a captive. It was maintaining custody. Behind closed doors, Roman administrators debated outcomes, not her death that was premature, but her utility. Would her survival strengthen Roman legitimacy? Would her removal stabilize Egypt? Would her presence in Rome serve as demonstration or distraction? These were not moral questions. They were logistical ones. Cleopatra was never consulted. The systems around her continued to tighten. Access to state resources was gradually severed. Funds required authorization. Supplies were rerouted. Even ceremonial expenditures required approval. This was not deprivation. It was dependency. Rome understood that control becomes complete when the subject no longer distinguishes between permission and necessity. Cleopatra's court life became minimal. Few visitors, repetitive routines, formal interactions stripped of warmth. The palace felt less like a residence, more like a monitored site. Still no violence, still no threats. Rome did not need them. The psychological pressure came from predictability. Each day resembled the last, no decisions, no developments, just waiting. Waiting without information is destabilizing. Cleopatra attempted adaptation. She adjusted language, reduced demands. Maintained composure. Rome noted this with approval. Compliance simplified administration, but compliance did not restore agency. Roman power functioned best when its subjects internalized limits. Outside, the Roman narrative was already forming. Egypt was being described as stabilized, order restored. Transition complete. Cleopatra was mentioned less frequently and when mentioned as a resolved factor. She was being written out while still alive. This was deliberate. Rome preferred its endings clean. By the time any final decision approached, Cleopatra's political relevance had already expired. The city no longer waited for her. The institutions no longer referenced her. The people adjusted. When Rome eventually acted, it would not feel abrupt. It would feel overdue. The final phase required one thing: absence of disruption. And Cleopatra, isolated within an intact body and an empty role, had been positioned perfectly for that outcome. Her last days were not defined by suffering. They were defined by systemization. She had become a controlled variable within Roman administration. And Rome never lost control of its variables. Roman administrators had already detached her from governance, ritual authority, and public expectation. When her name was spoken, it carried historical weight but no operational consequence. Egypt functioned. Rome advanced. The system no longer required her participation. This is how Rome preferred its endings, not sudden, not disruptive, already complete before acknowledged. Cleopatra's surroundings reflected this transition. The palace remained staffed but minimally. Ceremonial spaces were quiet, communications slowed further, decisions were finalized elsewhere. She was not informed of outcomes. Outcomes no longer required her awareness. Rome had reached the stage where Cleopatra's existence was no longer a factor to manage, but a record to close. The Roman institution was careful here. A living queen still carried symbolic risk. A mistreated queen created resentment. A dramatized end created legend. Rome wanted none of these, so Rome allowed silence. Silence denied spectacle. Silence denied narrative ownership. What followed was not a moment, but a disappearance from process. Cleopatra ceased to appear in reports. Her name stopped circulating in administrative correspondence. No orders referenced her presence. She had not been removed, she had been excluded. This was erasure by omission. Roman historians later treated her end as inevitable, almost natural. Their accounts are brief, controlled, and unspecific. That brevity was not due to lack of information. It was policy. Rome documented everything except what it preferred to dissolve. Cleopatra's legacy did not vanish through destruction. It vanished through reassignment. Egypt was reorganized under Roman authority. Temples continued, trade resumed, governance normalized. There was no vacuum. This was Rome's greatest strength. It left nothing visibly broken. Cleopatra's image survived but transformed. She became an example, not a participant. A cautionary figure referenced when convenient, dismissed when not. Her complexity was simplified. Her agency reduced to reaction. Rome shaped memory the way it shaped territory. What was preserved was controllable. What was not was allowed to fade. There was no official declaration. No announcement marking her end as a turning point. Rome did not need one. The transition had already been absorbed. The absence of drama was the message. Cleopatra's final days were not designed to be remembered. They were designed to be irrelevant. And yet this method left an echo, because silence invites reconstruction. Later generations would fill the gaps. They would imagine scenes, motives, emotions. They would supply spectacle where Rome removed it. Cleopatra would reemerge not as a ruler under administration, but as a symbol beyond Rome's control. This was the unintended consequence. Rome erased the process, but not the figure. Cleopatra survived history not through resistance, but through absence. The lack of detail made her adaptable. Myth filled what documentation withheld. Rome achieved administrative victory, but narrative control weakened over time. Egypt became a province. Rome expanded, the system succeeded, yet Cleopatra remained, not as Rome recorded her, but as Rome failed to define her fully. Her last days, stripped of violence and drama, reveal the truest form of Roman power, not the sword, not punishment, but the ability to make a sovereign disappear without visible force. No closure was provided, no finality declared. Only an echo, quiet, unresolved, and resistant to control. That echo remains.